Okay, so welcome back. I hope you watched that video to get your head into this notion of exercise addiction. Many of us exercise regularly. I am one of those people, as you guys know very well. I've been exercising since I was, 17, with a strong degree of regularity. I was a competitive power lifter years ago. Exercise is a really important part of my life. So is there such a thing as exercise addiction, and what is the difference between being enthusiastic about exercise, being committed to exercise, and the health in terms of psychological and physical that it brings versus something that some clinicians are calling an addictive process? And does this make sense to you? I hope you watch that video to get yourself thinking about this. Now, I want to distinguish between what researchers refer to as primary and secondary exercise addiction. As I kind of alluded to in my previous video, secondary exercise addiction occurs in conjunction with a diagnosable disorder. Most commonly, as I mentioned on my prior video, eating disorders such as anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. Studies suggest this is more common in females than males and occurs as comorbid with eating disorders and body image issues. Body dysmorphic disorder, like eating disorders, is a current diagnosis in the DSM. It is actually now in the DSM-5 part of the spectrum of obsessive compulsive spectrum disorders. Body dysmorphic disorder involves a preoccupation with an imagined defect in some part of the body or an extreme exaggeration of a very minor flaw in the body. So people with body dysmorphic disorder, for example, may see their face or something on their face as grossly misshapen when it isn't. Or if they have a very small scar, they see it as much more problematic than it actually is. And they become so obsessive thinking about that flaw that they will do things to try to compensate for the anxiety that thinking about that flaw causes. In some cases, they go for excessive plastic surgery to correct this imagined defect or this minor defect. And if they did have something and they did get it corrected with plastic surgery, they're not satisfied. They still see it as flawed, and they continue to seek out more and more and more and more surgeries to try to rectify what they perceive as a defect or a deformity. We're going to talk a little bit later before we end class today about a special kind of dysmorphia we see in bodybuilding competitors, and that is known as muscle dysmorphia. So I'll get back to that later. But secondary exercise addiction is well documented in the research on eating disorders and body dysmorphia. And it is secondary because it occurs as a result of and comorbid with a primary disorder that involves dissatisfaction with the body, like body dysmorphic disorder, or eating disorder problems where people see themselves as fat or overweight and desperately try to rectify that. I want you to take a look at a clip that I've put on slide 13 for you that specifically relates to body dysmorphic disorder. So take a look at that clip before you move on to the next slide. When exercise addiction is accompanied by anorexia and the primary motivation for the individual in engaging in that addictive exercise routine is weight loss, we call this anorexia athletica. Anorexia athletica, because the reason for the excessive exercise behavior is driven by symptoms of anorexia where the person believes he or she is fat and is trying to lose weight despite actually being emaciated and underweight. Another cause for secondary exercise addiction is bulimia nervosa. This involves a cycle of binging and purging. And so what happens is during the binge cycle, individuals take in an excessive amount of calories, typically comfort foods, typically high-fat, high-sugar foods, the kinds of foods I mentioned in our food addiction lectures. Typically, people will take in somewhere between 6,000 and even 10,000 calories in one sitting. Hard to believe, far more than the necessary intake to maintain weight on a daily basis and not driven by something like a sporting activity or needing to bulk up for some athletic event. When they do this out of it, and it really is a frenzied, out of control eating pattern during the binge cycle. It's described by people who have bulimia as an out-of-control frenzied eating with excessive caloric intake of comfort foods, often accompanied by depressive emotional states, anxious emotional states. Afterwards, the individual feels very guilty and very upset that they've taken in this amount of calories. So they try then to compensate for that caloric intake, not only because they feel guilty about it, but also worrying that they're now going to gain lots of weight as a result. So then they compensate with the purge component of the binge purge cycle. Purge means to get rid of. So they're trying to find ways to get rid of those calories. And one of the many ways that people try to do this who have bulimia nervosa is to engage in excessive compulsive exercise activity, hoping they can rid themselves of the weight gained by these excessive frenzied binge cycles of eating. Okay, now I want to distinguish those forms of secondary exercise addiction, which are well documented in the literature and part of diagnoses that we do have in the DSM, with primary exercise addiction. This is the one that is more controversial. This is a standalone concept, not part of another disorder that is not actually currently its own diagnosis in the DSM-5, although many clinicians treat it like it's a diagnosis and still treat individuals for it, much like sex addiction is not actually its own diagnosis, but nonetheless, clinicians are treating it like it is. Here we have a situation in which there is no other psychological or behavioral condition being diagnosed other than the excessive exercise behavior. The main problem is itself what the clinician believes to be exercise addiction or compulsive exercise. There are some studies that suggest this is more common in males than females, this primary exercise addiction, but the story is still out on that, and we do need more research to indicate whether or not that is the case. And again, there might be some diagnostic bias involved there. So before you move on to slide 14, I do want you to take a look at the link I provided for you on this slide regarding body dysmorphic disorder to get a better sense of what that disorder involves. And then meet me on slide number 14.